the rustle of silk in a darkened corridor, the glint of a lacquered screen catching candlelight, and the shallow, measured breath of a young man whose fate was no longer his own. In the stifling chambers of a Japanese lord's residence, a concubine awaited a summons that could mean pleasure, pain, or death. In the waning days of Japan's medieval era, the life of a male concubine was a web of submission, political intrigue, and subtle violence, woven in a place where one wrong glance could cost a man everything. Their stories are rarely told, but behind closed doors they were trapped in a gilded cage, as beautiful as it was suffocating. In the shadowed centuries of Japan's medieval and early Edo periods, a complex network of power and pleasure arose within samurai and aristocratic households. While women concubines are well documented in the annals of Japanese history, there also existed a far less spoken of class of male concubines, drawn from the ranks of handsome young pages, performing boys, or sons of lesser vassals. These boys, sometimes barely older than 15, were groomed to serve powerful daimyo, warlords, or wealthy court nobles, fulfilling roles that blurred the line between page, servant, companion, and sexual partner. The system that gave rise to these concubines was rooted in multiple layers of Japanese custom. Among the warrior elite, the ideals of wakashudo, or the way of youths, framed same-sex relationships between older patrons and younger boys, not merely as sexual, but also as educational and spiritual. In practice, however, these relationships often stripped away a young man's agency, making him a pawn in the personal and political games of his master. The boy's worth was measured in elegance, obedience, and physical grace, while his fate might rest on the shifting mood of a powerful lord. During the Sengoku period, a time of nearly constant civil war, male concubines could be more than private lovers. They were also instruments of loyalty. A lord might accept a page into his bedchamber to ensure that his vassal family stayed loyal, binding that family to him through intimate ties. Once inside the inner palace, the boy was subject to an elaborate code of rules, dictating everything from how he walked to the tilt of his head when speaking. To displease his master was unthinkable. These men, though elevated in status compared to common servants, still existed at the mercy of their lord's shifting alliances, jealous wives, and the ever-present threat of violent intrigue. One such youth, whom records only name as Haru, was a minor vassal's son in the service of a powerful daimyo in the mid-1500s. Haru had been chosen at the age of 14, taken from the countryside where he had run barefoot through rice paddies, to the forbidding halls of the warlord's Kyoto residence. There, he was trained in etiquette, poetry, the subtle language of flirtation, and in the arts of sensual pleasure. For Haru, the transition was like stepping into a dream or a nightmare. At first, he was fed sweet rice cakes and dressed in robes of rich brocade, but every indulgence came with a cost: absolute obedience, and the unspoken understanding that his body now belonged to another. In the earliest weeks of his new life, Haru struggled to comprehend how delicately balanced his existence had become. His lord was known for a cruel temper and for dispensing favor with chilling unpredictability. One night might bring gentle affection and whispered verses of courtly love, the next a slap across the face for forgetting to bow low enough upon entering the chamber. Servants gossiped about other boys who had fallen from favor and been dismissed in shame, or worse, quietly poisoned to prevent them from carrying tales outside the walls. Haru learned to read the smallest shifts in his master's expression: a tightening of the jaw, a glimmer of pleasure in narrowed eyes. He moved like a dancer, mindful of every gesture, trained to anticipate a whim before it was spoken. The other concubines, older and more practiced, watched him with wary sympathy. They had survived long enough to know the cost of a single mistake. Behind the paper walls of the inner residence, Haru's world narrowed to a handful of rooms, the murmurs of ladies in waiting, the rustle of courtiers' garments, and the endless performance of servitude. Outside, Japan was a land torn by feudal warlords, castle sieges, and shifting alliances. But inside the palace, another kind of war played out in silken chambers, a war of the body and soul. This is where Haru's horrific journey truly began. The mornings in Haru's new prison were deceptively serene. Sunlight spilled through the paper shoji screens, dancing across polished tatami floors as though nothing dark could ever hide here. But behind this illusion lay the same suffocating dread. Haru was roused each day before dawn, groomed and dressed by attendants who spoke to him in clipped, wary tones, then sent to practice the calligraphy and poetry demanded of a companion who must please not only in bed, but also in mind. His lord was an educated man, fond of reciting the Manyoshu or composing melancholy verses about loyalty and death. Haru had to memorize them perfectly. The training was relentless. An older concubine named Sora, who had survived nearly 5 years in service, an eternity by their standards, took him under his wing, though not out of kindness alone. It was a matter of self-preservation. If Haru failed, the entire household might suffer the Lord's rage. Sora taught him to forsake gracefully, to kneel with the correct posture, to smile with just enough sweetness that it appeared genuine but not brazen. Haru's mistakes were corrected with sharp slaps across the knuckles or humiliating lectures that left him trembling with shame. Beyond the refined veneer, there lurked an undercurrent of fear that could not be spoken aloud. Rumors crept through the inner palace of boys who vanished after an act of defiance, of beatings behind closed fusuma doors, of a senior retainer who took pleasure in making new concubines crawl like animals to amuse him. Haru learned to keep his gaze lowered and his words soft, never drawing attention except to flatter or obey. At night, he was summoned to the Lord's chambers. The rituals were unyielding, cleansing baths with perfumed water, then kneeling outside the sliding screens until called. Once inside, Haru became an object of desire, a beautiful decoration to be admired, handled, or discarded according to his master's mood. Some nights ended with a tender, almost fatherly embrace, other times with roughness that left bruises hidden beneath layers of silk. There was no pattern, no logic, only the Lord's shifting storms. Even beyond the physical degradation, Haru felt the crushing weight of something deeper, the annihilation of his sense of self. He had no voice, no right to refuse, no hope for escape. Yet within him burned a stubborn ember of memory, of a boy who once ran through green fields under a blue sky. That memory became both comfort and torment, reminding him of the freedom that was gone. Meanwhile, outside the high walls, the world was in upheaval. The Onin War had left Kyoto scorched and divided. Rival daimyo wrestled for power while peasants starved in the countryside. It was a time of brutal chaos. Yet inside the palace, a perverse elegance persisted. There were poetry contests and moon-viewing banquets, elaborate performances staged just steps away from rooms where concubines suffered. The contradiction was almost too cruel to comprehend. Sora once told Haru, in a hushed moment between candlelit lessons, that beauty itself was a kind of weapon. Our prettiness, he whispered, is a sword they turn against us. If we were not beautiful, they would cast us aside. But because we are, we suffer. Those words sank into Haru like a blade. He could see the truth of it in every gesture of the Lord's possessive eyes. Every night he was summoned. Every day he was made to recite poems about fidelity. Over time, Haru grew skilled at this dreadful dance. He learned to anticipate the Lord's jokes, to laugh lightly when required, to mask the ache in his soul with an artful tilt of the head. In moments of stolen solitude, he sometimes wept, but only in silence, terrified anyone might hear. Tears were dangerous. They revealed too much. One night, as winter pressed its cold hand against the paper walls, Haru was called to the Lord's chamber earlier than usual. His heart sank. Early summons often meant his master was in a foul mood. Trembling, he made his way through the lantern-lit corridor, the hush of the palace broken only by the faint rustle of his silk robes. The Lord was waiting, sitting cross-legged before a brazier, a distant look on his face. "Come," he commanded. Haru knelt, bowing so low his forehead nearly touched the mat. There was no warmth in the Lord's voice tonight. Without a word, he seized Haru's chin and forced him to look up. The eyes that met his were cold and hard, unblinking. "Have you been faithful?" the Lord asked in a low, dangerous tone. Haru's breath caught in his throat. There was only one answer that could save him. "Yes, my lord." A moment of silence stretched like a blade between them. Then, slowly, the Lord released his grip and nodded, as if satisfied for now. Haru bowed again, pressing his trembling palms against the tatami. His life was hanging by a thread, and he knew it. Each night could be his last, each smile a lie, each pleasure an ordeal. The horrific life of a male concubine was this: to live in terror behind painted screens, to be beautiful but never free, to be desired but never truly seen. As winter deepened, a harsh chill invaded even the grandest corridors of the Lord's palace. The brazier embers barely held back the cold that crept through sliding doors, biting into Haru's bones as surely as the fear that had taken root in his heart. Nights grew longer, more dangerous, and each one brought new tests of his endurance. The Lord's mood was increasingly erratic, fueled by the pressures of war beyond the palace walls and conspiracies whispered among his retainers. Haru had learned to exist in that shifting darkness, to anticipate a strike, to soothe a savage temper, to mold his responses like a potter shaping clay. But even so, the smallest slip could unravel everything. One night, a passing glance to a visiting retainer brought Haru to the brink of ruin. The Lord, drunk and wild-eyed, accused him of disloyalty, of harboring secret affections. Before Haru could explain, a backhanded slap split his lip, the copper tang of blood mingling with tears he dared not shed aloud. He was confined for 2 days afterward, locked behind a cedar panel while his lord decided his fate. The darkness was nearly total, the only sound the creak of wooden beams and his own ragged breathing. When he was finally summoned, Haru feared it would be the last time he ever walked the length of that lantern-lit corridor. But the Lord, as changeable as a spring storm, offered him sake instead of punishment, a gesture that chilled Haru more than any beating could. There was no pattern, no logic, only an endless tightrope walk between delight and destruction. Within the walls of the palace, a male concubine status was a fragile thing. Outsiders sometimes imagined they lived in decadent comfort, with rich silks, precious perfumes, and endless feasts. In truth, these luxuries were shackles. Their beauty had to be meticulously maintained with special creams, oils, and powdered rice. They were watched constantly by senior attendants, who might report the slightest flaw in appearance. Even their diets were controlled, keeping them slender and pale to please their master's taste. It was a prison of elegance. Sora, the older concubine, understood this far too well. One night, while the Lord was away at a war council, he shared more of the hidden rules. "We are not meant to be happy," he confided, eyes shadowed by a guttering candle flame. "We are meant to be beautiful and obedient. They will destroy you if you forget that." Haru tried to ask how he had survived for so long, but Sora only shook his head, lips tight with secrets too dangerous to name. The psychological torment was worse than any physical blow. Haru began to fear his own thoughts, worried they might show on his face, that even a flash of longing for freedom might betray him. He learned to bury every honest emotion under layers of trained smiles. At night, after his duties were performed, he lay awake staring at the painted screens, dreaming of home, but no dream could protect him from the next summons. As the new year approached, the palace filled with visiting dignitaries and lesser lords, all eager to pledge loyalty or seek favor. Haru was put on display like a prized hawk, made to serve drinks, recite poetry, and show off his flawless manners. Each guest's hungry eyes reminded him he was a trophy, no different than a prized sword or a rare painting. Worse still, many would bid for a night alone with him, offering gold or alliances to share his body. His lord, greedy for leverage, sometimes agreed. The first time Haru was lent to another, he felt his heart die a little. Though trained to expect it, he had not truly believed his lord would allow another to use him. That night, his new master, a retainer older and rougher than the Lord, treated him like a living doll, praising his beauty even as he left bruises on his arms and neck. When Haru returned to his usual quarters, he was not permitted to speak of it. No one offered comfort. Over time, these encounters stole away pieces of him, like moths devouring silk. He became quieter, more hollow, going through each day in a haze of forced smiles and memorized verses. Only Sora seemed to see the shadow growing in his eyes, but even he could do nothing. They were both captives of the same beautiful cage, both chained by duty and fear. And then, a rumor began to spread through the inner palace. The Lord's political fortunes were turning. Defeats on the battlefield, disloyal vassals, a failed alliance, all threatened to bring ruin upon their household. That meant change was coming, and for men like Haru, Change could be the most terrifying thing of all. He had been taught that a concubine's fate was bound to his master's. If the lord fell, Haru could expect nothing but disgrace or death. Worse still, if a rival faction took power, he might be handed over as a spoil of war, a prize for another master. The knowledge made each passing night heavier, each bow more difficult, each performance more poisoned. Haru could feel the ground shifting beneath him, but there was nowhere to run. His body was property, and property could not flee. He could only wait, enduring each cold night, praying the day of reckoning might somehow spare him, though deep in his heart, he knew it would not. The first crack in the illusion of safety came with the news that the lord had lost a critical battle to a rival daimyo. The household reeled. Retainers fled, fearing execution or confiscation of their lands, while courtiers whispered of shifting loyalties and betrayals. Inside the concubines' quarters, fear bloomed like a poisonous flower. Haru's lord returned from the field in a black mood, reeking of horse sweat and blood, and took out his rage on any who dared meet his eyes. For Haru, those were days of unimaginable terror. Each night he was called to the lord's side, forced to comfort a man unraveling under the weight of military failure. The lord's hands, once indulgent, became fists that struck without warning. No mistake went unpunished. The slightest hesitation brought a backhand across Haru's cheek. A slip in posture earned a beating with a bamboo rod. Haru's body, once pampered and prized, became marked with bruises and cuts hidden under layers of silk. The other concubines, equally fearful, kept their distance. Even Sora had grown quiet, unable to shield Haru from this new brutality. "Stay silent," he advised in a low voice one night. "He will break you if you resist. We can only survive if we yield." But Haru felt something shifting within himself, a small spark of rebellion refusing to be extinguished, no matter how often he was beaten or shamed. There were moments, in those days of darkness, when Haru thought of ending his own life. Many before him had chosen that path rather than face disgrace or continued torment. Slipping a blade into the sleeve of one's robe or stepping into the icy river, there were ways to reclaim some measure of freedom. But Haru could not bring himself to do it. Even the faintest hope that one day he might see the world beyond these painted walls held him back. Then, in the cold rain of early spring, the castle fell. Enemy banners flapped at the gates, and the defenders, exhausted, demoralized, laid down their weapons. Chaos followed. Looters ran through the halls, searching for gold and women to claim. The lord, seeing his end approach, gathered his remaining retainers for a final stand, and forced Haru to attend him, draped in formal robes like some grisly mascot of doomed beauty. When the attackers breached the audience chamber, Haru's master was cut down where he stood. Blood sprayed across Haru's white sleeves, warm and horrifying. The boy collapsed, too stunned to scream, as armored men stepped over the corpse of the only master he had ever known. His body trembled, expecting death next. But death did not come. The new lord, victorious and ruthless, looked upon Haru and saw value in him, a token of the previous regime's submission. Haru was seized, stripped of the bloodied robe, and handed over as part of the spoils. There would be no freedom, only a new chain. This new master was no gentler than the last. A powerful daimyo with a reputation for cruelty, he took Haru as a sign of his triumph, parading him before guests like a trophy. Haru was forced to serve at banquets where the conquering generals feasted, pouring sake with a trembling hand, while they joked about the boy's pretty face and graceful manners. His nights became even more terrifying. The new lord did not bother with poetry or subtle rituals. He saw Haru as an object for his pleasure alone. Haru's screams were muffled by a silk cloth, his tears ignored. There was no sympathy, no quiet moments of kindness, only raw, unrestrained power. The other concubines in the new household treated him as a rival or an interloper, refusing to speak to him. Isolated, stripped of even Sora's companionship, Haru sank into a kind of numb despair. Each day felt like drowning in darkness. His beauty, which had once elevated him, was now a curse that made him forever a captive. Rumors reached him through hushed voices that other male concubines had been killed rather than kept, that some had been forced to entertain soldiers until their bodies gave out. Haru knew he was only spared because of his reputation, the whispered stories of his skill and grace. but that only prolonged his suffering. The new lord's favor was even more dangerous than his indifference. By the start of summer, Haru had grown so thin his ribs showed through the fine silk of his robes. His skin, once soft, was marred by bruises that never quite faded. The mirror no longer reflected the spirited boy who had arrived from the countryside years before. It showed only a mask, carefully arranged, obedient, broken. Yet somewhere deep inside, that tiny ember of resistance still glowed. On rare nights, he remembered running through rice paddies, laughing, barefoot in the mud, and for the briefest instant, he could breathe again. That memory, fragile as a dragonfly's wing, kept him from going mad. In that stolen piece of his heart, Haru nurtured a question he barely dared to shape in words. Was there any escape left in this world, or was he doomed to serve until death, passed from master to master like a lacquered cup? His story was far from over, but it was about to reach its darkest chapter yet. Summer's heat pressed down on the conquered castle like a suffocating blanket, amplifying the stench of sweat, lacquered armor, and fear. Haru moved through the days in a trance, bowing and serving as required, his mind half detached from the reality of hands grabbing him, lips forcing against his own, or the cruel jokes that echoed through the corridors as men praised the spoils of war. His existence had become a grotesque performance, each movement rehearsed, each word weighed to avoid punishment. The new lord's household was more brutal and less refined than the first. There were no poetry contests, no lessons in music or calligraphy. Instead, there were drunken revels, gambling, and brutal tests of loyalty among the retainers. Haru was expected to entertain these rough men, who had only known battle and bloodshed. They saw him as a living prize, proof of their master's dominance over the old regime. His delicate features, once praised in hushed tones, were now displayed openly as proof of conquest. Some nights, Haru was passed among high-ranking guests as a gesture of goodwill. There was no ritual or pretense, just raw, transactional exploitation. Each new hand on his skin felt like another nail, sealing away the person he used to be. His body had become a tool of politics, as impersonal as a scroll bearing a seal. The worst of it was the emptiness that crept into his heart. Where once there had been a spark of rebellion or even a fragile hope, now there was mostly a chilling numbness. When he looked into the mirror, he barely recognized the hollow, lifeless eyes that stared back. He was fading, piece by piece, into nothing. One night, after being sent to serve sake at a victory feast, Haru collapsed in a corridor, too weak to stand. His limbs trembled uncontrollably, and for a moment, he truly believed he might die there, alone on the cold, polished floor. A kitchen servant found him and hurriedly dragged him aside, whispering a prayer under her breath as she cleaned away the vomit and tears. There was no kindness in her touch, only a mechanical pity, like one might offer a sick dog. The following morning, Haru was ordered before the new lord. Rumors had spread that he had shamed the household by collapsing. The lord regarded him with an expression of bored cruelty, the way a cat might study a broken toy. "You are still pretty," the lord sneered. "But if you are too weak to serve, you are worthless." A retainer stepped forward, suggesting that Haru be cast out. Another, who coveted him, proposed selling him to a merchant house for a price. But the lord, perhaps to prove his power, refused. Instead, he ordered Haru to be beaten with bamboo rods until he could stand on his own again, a twisted test of resilience. Haru endured the punishment in a haze of pain, every strike ringing through him until his vision went white. When it was over, he was left on the floor, gasping, skin striped with angry red welts. Somehow, he rose to his knees, head bowed, accepting his place once more. There was no escape, he realized at least, none that would leave him breathing. Days later, as he slowly recovered, the new lord began to lose interest. Other prizes, other conquests, took his attention. Haru, once the center of his amusement, became an afterthought, a half-forgotten ornament. Though that should have brought relief, it only deepened Haru's despair. He had been reduced to nothing, no longer even valuable enough to warrant a moment's cruelty. His body healed, but his spirit remained shattered. Nights were filled with nightmares of the men who had used him, of his first lord's face twisted in dying agony, of Sora's quiet resignation. He wondered where Sora was now, if he had survived the castle's fall, or if he had found a quicker, kinder end. Weeks turned into months, and Haru felt himself becoming invisible. Other concubines, other servants, stepped around him as though he were a ghost. His duties dwindled, and his place in the new lord's favor grew ever more uncertain. In that emptiness, Haru found the smallest spark of freedom, the chance to slip away, if only for a moment. One night, when the lord was away on a campaign, Haru crept outside the inner residence for the first time since his capture. The gardens were overgrown, lanterns unlit, the night air heavy with the scent of summer grass. He stood under a twisted pine tree and looked up at the stars, tears sliding silently down his cheeks. For the first time in years, he felt alone in a way that was terrifying, but also full of possibility. Somewhere, deep within him, that boy from the rice paddies still lived. Haru realized he had to nurture that tiny fragment if he was ever to survive, to reclaim any piece of himself. Though he had no plan, no allies, and no power, he made a vow under the pale starlight. I will endure, and I will not forget who I was. Even in his horrific life, even when stripped of dignity, Haru held onto that vow, a single thin thread against the darkness. In the world of men who bought and broke bodies, he would cling to memory, no matter the price. The chill of early autumn crept into the palace, bringing with it a shift in fortunes as yet another rival lord began pressing against the household's fragile hold on power. Rumors of rebellion, plots, and shifting alliances spread through the dim corridors like a disease. The new lord, paranoid and erratic, lashed out with sudden executions, floggings, and cruel demands for loyalty oaths. Amid this storm, Haru found himself all but forgotten, a discarded relic in an age that devoured beauty and innocence without a second thought. In that neglect, Haru discovered a dangerous form of liberty. No longer constantly summoned or paraded before guests, he was allowed to fade into the background, little more than a silent servant. His robes were plainer, his duties simpler, tending lamps, fetching scrolls, reciting a verse if asked, and for the first time in years, no one reached for his body in the night. It was not freedom, but it was as close as he could imagine. Each quiet moment became precious. Haru began to observe the patterns of the guards, the changing schedules of gatekeepers, and the quiet arguments of kitchen staff. An idea slowly took root, fed by the tiny ember of resistance he had kept alive all these years. Escape. The plan was half mad, built on hope rather than certainty, but even hope was a powerful fuel. He knew where the side garden gate stood, and he knew there were stretches of night when no one watched it. The old Haru, the village boy who once ran barefoot under the sun, would have leapt for freedom without a second thought. But the Haru who had survived so many nights of horror moved cautiously. He gathered leftover rice balls from the kitchens, tucked away a simple homespun cloak, and waited for the night when the Lord would be drunk on victory wine after a successful skirmish. That was the night he would try. When the hour came, Haru slipped out like a shadow. His heart thundered in his chest as he crossed the silent courtyard, every step a test of courage. One servant spotted him, but after a moment's stunned pause, turned away, unwilling to risk involvement. That tiny mercy felt like a blessing. Haru reached the side gate, pressed the latch open, and stepped through into a world that felt impossibly vast. Beyond the walls, the air was cold, the grass wet with autumn dew. Haru ran until his legs burned, through rice fields and lonely lanes, until the first light of dawn streaked across the sky. He kept running, leaving behind the name, the pain, and the suffocating cages of the palaces. By midday, he reached a village market where no one recognized him. There, trembling and filthy, he sank to the ground, overwhelmed by the realization he was free. Freedom, however, was not kind. Haru had no family left who would take him in, no money, and no skills except those taught in the twisted world of concubinage. When he asked for work, farmers averted their eyes, uncomfortable with the broken beauty before them. For days he survived on charity and scraps, sleeping under eaves or in abandoned sheds. But for all its cruelty, the world beyond the walls was still sweeter than the silken prison. Slowly, he began to rebuild. An old temple took pity on him, letting him sweep the grounds and serve simple meals to pilgrims. The monks asked no questions, only gave him a place to rest, a chance to begin healing. It was there, sitting before a rough wooden Buddha, that Haru finally allowed himself to cry. Tears for all the boys who had never escaped, for Sora whose fate he might never know, for the countless nameless youths whose beauty had been turned into a weapon against them. As seasons turned, Haru's bruises faded and the nightmares eased. In the temple's peace, he learned a different rhythm of living, one without endless fear. He found quiet joy in mending robes, arranging flowers, even in simple chanting. Each act was a tiny reclaiming of his stolen humanity, but he could never fully leave the past behind. Sometimes, a voice or a scent would drag him back to those painted screens, to nights of forced pleasure in the hands of men who thought they owned him. He would tremble and have to steady himself with prayer, breathing through the old pain. Those scars were woven too deep to ever truly vanish. And yet, he survived. In that survival lay a kind of triumph. He had endured what countless others had not. His life was not a song of victory, but a testament to resilience, to the fragile, impossible strength of the human spirit. Years later, travelers passing through the temple sometimes asked about the quiet, graceful man who served tea with a sad but peaceful smile. They never guessed he had once belonged to a powerful warlord, that he had been a concubine, a living pawn in a brutal game of power. Haru never offered those details. They were wounds best left closed. But every night, as he lay on a simple straw mat under a leaky roof, Haru would remember, and in remembering, he honored those who had been lost. History rarely spares its pity for men like Haru, the beautiful, the obedient, the forgotten. Their lives existed in the shadows, woven into the grand tapestry of warlords and samurai, but unrecorded except in rare, faded scrolls. And so, we remember Haru now, a boy torn from innocence, used and discarded, who nevertheless refused to let the world erase him. If these walls could still speak, what other stories of pain and endurance would they tell? Perhaps one day, someone will ask why so many were made to suffer for another's pleasure, and whether we have truly learned from their sorrow.